So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kati Lindström. I'm the chair of the Council of Regional Representatives for the European Society of Environmental History, and it is my pleasure to greet you to this December 2024 edition of Environmental History Today seminar series, online seminar series that is hosted then by the Council of Regional Representatives. And this time around, we're visiting Romania. So the idea of the seminar series is that each month we'll be visiting a different region to see what's going on and what's happening. And so this time we will be hearing about Romanian environmental history. And the meeting will be chaired by our regional representative for Romania, Cosmin Cosor-Codrea. I hope I pronounced it all right. And it's him you need to contact if you want to know what's going on in Romania, you want to do something together, you want to get on a mailing list or do one. So contact Cosmin for everything that has to do with Romanian environmental history. So Cosmin, the floor is yours.
Well, thank you so much for your introduction. And before anything else, I would like to thank the conveners of the seminar series, Anna Olenenko, Nina Vieira, and Kati Lindström, and for facilitating throughout the academic year all the webinars. This is the last one. And I would also like to thank all of you for joining us, and many thanks, Georgia, for accepting our invitation. So another important aspect that I would like to point out is that if any of you would wish to find out more research dealing with the environmental history of Romania, please check the European Society Environmental History website, where you have the geography of Romania, and you will find several articles there and dealing with several issues. And also after the presentation, we will have a Q&A session, and you can use the raise your hand function, and I will try to collect all your questions, and we have plenty of time after George's presentation. And I think also this seminar comes right in place because yesterday Romania just passed the new forestry code. So our presentation today comes right in the right place. So I can't wait to hear George's presentation. Also about our presenter today, George Andrei is a historian of the global environmental and rural history of modern Romania. He recently completed his PhD at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he defended his dissertation in 2024 called Our Struggle for Existence, Negotiating Forestry, Rural Citizenship and State Building in Modern Romania. He's currently academic advisor in the Hamilton Lugar School of Global and International Studies at Indiana University at Bloomington. His research has been published in several journals such as Balkanology and the Journal of Romanian Studies, and has been supported by Fulbright Fellowship, the Forest History Society, and the U.S. National Council for Eurasian and East European Research. Also this year, he was the co-winner of the Kate Hitchens Best Dissertation Award from the Society of Romanian Studies. And congratulations, George, for your achievement. And today, his title of presentation is called Dreaming of the English Indies, Civilizing Mission, Racial Hygiene, and the Origins of Romanian Forestry Institutions. So from here, if you're comfortable, George, the floor is yours, and good luck for the presentation.
Okay, thank you so much, Cosmin, and thank you all for coming today to this presentation. And thank you, of course, to the organizers of these series for putting it together. My presentation today delves into the relationship of, or rather the relationship that Romanian foresters cultivated with especially foresters in imperial service, particularly in the British Empire, and their seeming obsession with India as an example to follow. This is not what my project started out as. I initially, and much of my project still looked at the environmental history of rural forests in the interwar period in the 1920s and 30s. But as I was researching, especially looking for secondary literature, I just found that there was nothing covering almost anything before the 1910 Forest Code, which was really the forest code that set Romania up with the kind of modern institutions, we might say, that still exist today in the form of, for instance, Romsilva, the national state enterprise dealing with the state's forests. So this kind of research started very organically with me just, back tracing the history of forestry in Romania, seeing, okay, Marin Dracea, who was his mentor? Okay, and then who was this guy's mentor? And kind of just seeing, okay, where did these people start? And I'll delve into a bit of that today. But really, what I want to kind of say with this opening remark is that it was not my intention to really go back to late 19th century Romania with this project. I didn't start looking for colonial connections. I didn't start looking into, where Romanian foresters got their ideas, but it so happened that I ended up in this direction, and it's one that I'm very happy with how it turned out, and one that I'm very interested in continuing research on. Now, the kind of things that I'm going to be talking about today, I'll speak a bit towards the end of the presentation to say, how are they continuing? How do we still see these things in modern society today? Unfortunately, I wasn't able to integrate any commentary on the kind of new forest code, which is breaking news more or less. But what I want to point out is that even in the later interwar period, we see these ideas playing out in representations of Romanian foresters. For instance, we have a caricature of an engineer here, Malchanovski, who was working in northern Romania at the time, and I will speak more about northern Romania in this period. And also, I'm going to be repeatedly coming back to this caricature, which features, the palm tree, the lion, the snake, and of course the racist stereotype of the kind of, the groups that they assumed to be living in such spaces. And I'm going to make a very kind of particular argument about this one. But what I want to also point out here is that this is by far not the only caricature that I have found that deals with these kind of orientalizing and tropicalizing themes. I just picked one of them to go with for this presentation, but there are many, many such caricatures among kind of more, reasonable depictions of the job that Romanian foresters did in the 1920s and 30s. So my research ended up taking me to the 1870s and 1880s in Romania as it was then, because in 1885 and 1886, I found a Romanian group of foresters and like-minded professionals assembled to concretize efforts to establish a permanent presence for state forestry institutions in Romania, which simply did not exist before. There had been many previous attempts to create such institutions, especially educational institutions, that were ultimately all aborted or lasted only a few short years without many results. But for these individuals, this was a project that could no longer, Romania could no longer wait for these institutions. Because for decades, Romanian, often French-trained Romanian and foreign foresters attempted to establish forestry in Romania without much success. And there had been efforts, again, various rubber-stamped efforts, all failed without any long-term successes. And so these individuals, by 1886, more or less began waging an all-out propaganda war, as we might call it, aimed at state administrators and rulers trying to sell their worldview, that forests could only be managed by the hands of experts, and that these experts, of course meaning them, needed to be empowered with coercive institutions in order to be able to carry out their mission, above all other interests or opposition. In 1886, these individuals founded the Progresul Silvic Society, or Forestry Progress Society, which was a professional society by and for Romania's forestry engineers, scientists, economists, landowners, whoever wanted to be part of this project, essentially. But there was a big problem. This was a society of professionals for a profession that did not exist, right? Romania had no functioning forestry corps, no institutions capable of creating or executing forestry management plans, little information and next to no land surveys were available or reliable. There was very little reliable information about the economy as a whole, let alone forests. And there were no permanent domestic educational facilities that they deemed appropriate for the job that they needed to do. And so I argue that modern Romanian forestry in this presentation emerged in intellectual and political conditions that they felt aligned themselves better to colonized and imperial spaces rather than Western European ones. And this kind of alignment served as both an inspiration and, in many ways, nightmare fuel for Romanian foresters because they came to see it as, well, I'll explain later in the presentation. I detail the arguments of what I call these individuals as forester activists, which I argue were a group of forestry professionals and allies who followed in the footsteps of their colleagues in colonial spaces, arguing the benefits of state forestry, not only from an economic perspective, but from a civilizational, medical, and climatic one as well. And these were all, of course, central to European imperial civilizing missions in the 19th century. Using this powerful civilizational rhetoric, case studies, and drawing on the lessons of imperial foresters and their contemporary understanding of the link between disease, race, climate, and other factors, Romanian foresters launched an all-out assault on traditional peasant life in Romania. And we're coming back to this image here. They claimed that the peasants' improper handling of forests and destructive tendencies created the conditions for the active degeneration of the Romanian body and mind from a European one to some kind of Afro-Asiatic other, revealing that in this caricature, Malchanovsky finds himself not in some exotic place. This is how he perceived and how his job was perceived in Romania, right? This is not any kind of exotic environment. This is the Romanian environment. This is not a racist caricature of an African. This is a Romanian peasant, right? Without the urgent intervention of modern forestry, therefore, the total state support for this internal civilizing mission, the Romanian countryside would cease to be European altogether, instead morphing into a tropical hellscape of deserts, disease, and torpor. The forester activists believed that they alone had the key to the salvation of the people and the nation. Well-tended temperate forests, they argued, and it was argued widely globally at the time, would not only boost productivity, but also health and the civilization and culture of rural society, simply through their existence, their beauty, and the fresh air that they generated, while keeping at the bay the so-called desert steppes of Asia, and by extension, their diseases. Especially at the time, cholera and yellow fever was on everybody's minds in relation to this part of the world. So using this colonial speak, Romanian foresters created an active, rotten interior, a so-called wild country in desperate need of scientific intervention. Naturally, it helped that their message was also economic, because not only would they render the nation's forests rich and beautiful, but also commercialize them as never before, which would result in material, mental, physical, and spiritual prosperity, pointing to similar instances and results in the British and French empires. The campaign was vital for Romanian forestry, as while Romania at this time instituted its first modern forest code in 1881, they argue that this code lacked the institutions necessary to enforce its provisions, those that they deemed adequate at all. And ultimately, this approach proved extremely effective, leading the Progresul Civic Society, which was kind of the main home of this activism, and the institutions it would give rise to wield incredible power over the nation's forests for over a century, in fact. So foresters weren't alone, obviously, in their mission to change rural Romanian society, and plenty of historians of medicine and historians of science have looked into these attempts to change Romania in the late 19th and 20th century. But they joined longer active networks of medical and scientific minds trying to sell various theories and practices to the Romanian public, and especially the political leadership. Right. So here we see some critiques of the Forestry Code of 1881. The code was poorly understood and the law voted without attention. They weren't consulted on it. Many errors made their way in. And the code actually made no provisions for the creation of an engineering corps to actually carry out any of the provisions as well. Foresters, of course, weren't alone. Forestry was however, among the first technosciences to be kind of attempt to mobilize itself in this way. Historian Ursula Klein describes the technosciences as those scientific disciplines that emerged from state sponsorship of so-called useful sciences under cameralism. Forestry, much like medicine, was a hybridization of science and the art of practice. But while medical intervention into the countryside were widely supported by powerful state institutions, the military, for instance, and I'll get to that in a second, forestry itself was a profession without many allies, either among the ruling landowning class or the peasantry, both of which looked suspiciously to their interventions. Even before 1886 and the founding of the Progresul Civic Society, foresters mobilized whatever means they had available to attempt to communicate their perspective to educated and popular audiences, engaging with other professionals and utilizing the scientific press to spread their message. Cosmin himself points out in his work that forestry was a key topic discussed in the pages of early scientific journals in Romania, including journals for the popularization of science like Revista Scientifica, the Scientific Review, which was published between 1870 and 1882. Indeed, among its first editors and contributors was Constantin Robescu, who would later, in fact, become, without any coincidence, of course, the inaugural president of the Progresul Civic Society a decade and a half later. Already in 1970, from the first appearance of Revista Scientifica, Robescu was publishing in this journal warning of the climatic effects of deforestation. Importantly, the founding of this society gave these activists their own space to develop and perfect their own messaging, right? Not having to rely on other publications. That same year, the society founded a journal, and it remains one of the longest published forestry journals in the world, Revista Pădurilor, the Forest Journal or the Journal of Forests, which was completely devoted to forestry-related questions, but not just technical ones, economic ones, social ones, and as we'll come to find out, civilizational ones, which joined the ranks of very few publications worldwide at that time related to these issues. This reveals that there were two foci of the society in its early days. The first was quite simply political economy, but the second was less explicit, but frequently hinted at. The mental positioning of Romanian forested environments relative to proper so-called European ones and those of so-called barbarous countries. And these are the terminologies that were used back then. Colonizing rhetoric marked the Romanian interior as wild, unproductive, or outright hazardous to European minds and bodies, and this was common in the first decades of the journal's publication. Much like in the Western imperial imagination, the marriage of tropical environments with the need for kind of special, highly paternalist administration contributed to the justification for exerting central administrative power over what was considered a backwards countryside. And now kind of a bit of background to how this is related to other areas, right? David Arnold, in his own work on British imperialism in South Asia, noted the importance of the creation of a sick and abstracted tropical environment and climate for rationalizing imperial intervention into traditional customs. Right, and we see this again coming back to this caricature. According to Arnold, tropicalization is a technique of othering beyond simple Orientalism, which was an overwhelmingly European epistemological maneuver founded in nature but pregnant with economic, political, and cultural significance. It completely marginalized or denied indigenous precedent, defining tropicalization as centering relationships between disease and death, escape only through improvement, and the leading role of nature, to the exclusion of non-European human agency, in totality. This is, in fact, the central theme that we see here in the caricature of Machanovsky. This was an ideal combination for forester activists who could point out the alleged wastefulness of non-scientific forms of management as the reasoning for the decline of civilizations. In fact, it was a long-established point of argument, not just in Romania, but across Europe, and one that Robescu himself used in 1870, my goodness, in Revista Scientifica. Forester activists, in looking at the administration of overseas European empires, had plenty of examples and role models. And perhaps no case attracted the eye of Romanian foresters, as I was very surprised to find, reading their correspondence and journals. No case attracted their eye as much as the work of their colleagues in South Asia and Southeast Asia, that is the British Raj. Scholars like Richard Grove, K.C. Ramakrishnan, and S. Ravirajan have demonstrated the importance of networks and their activism, as well as the ability of these networks to absorb and integrate knowledge and disperse it in other spaces that these networks possessed. In colonial and imperial contexts, the exertion of Western expertise over so-called primitive or tribal landscapes became the core, actually, of the colonial experience, with an effectiveness that had the capacity to radically change society and environments through processes of negotiation and hybridization on the one hand, but on the other hand, there are plenty of cases where this was done through outright genocide, right? And for forestry, these underlying civilizational motives were in no small part the result of the kind of physiocratic origins of forestry, as well as its relationship to medical practice in colonial space. Because as is pointed out by several scholars, the close connections between botany and forestry and medical practice in the Indian subcontinent was in fact, married by mostly Scottish imperial surgeons, right, who became botanists once they arrived in India. Notably, individuals like Edward Balfour, Alexander Gibson, who's not pictured here, and Hugh Cleghorn. These individuals led campaigns to advocate for continental forestry in India, stressing connections between health, ecology, race, and economy in imperial administration. They fought to establish the foundations of forestry in British India, where the idea proved, much like in Romania, unpopular among large landowners, plantation managers, local populations, but also among the imperial administration, who saw it as a potentially destabilizing force. The success of these networks was predicated on arguments about the connections between people and their environments, as well as the profitability of fine-tuning this relationship. There has to be some kind of economic component, right? And these ideas originated, of course, from ecologies of improvement debated back home in their native Scotland. This approach, influenced by the failure of other arguments to convince colonial administrators, led to the amalgamation of the ecological arguments that then carried not only economic, but also medical and civilizational logic. So this is all to say that even the economic arguments for forestry heavily depended on a civilizing mission. Like the surgeons turned botanists before him, German botanist turned imperial administrator Dietrich Brandis was the founder of, really the kind of father of imperial forestry in the British Empire, and the activism networks of foresters, surgeons, and other natural scientists that were established at this time in the British Empire were critical to shifting administrative subjectivities toward forestry. And not just that in the empire, and not just in that empire, but kind of across, through trans-imperial networks and transnational networks as well. It was already in the kind of early in mid-19th century that these forestry agents used claims of deforestations caused by the so-called careless rapacity of the native population as a justification for demanding that the state empower and bestow foresters with institutions wielding coercive power to control not only landscapes, but also bodies. The fundamental difference, as Ravirajan notes, between this new forestry and older forestry practices in Western and Central Europe were essentially one of a relationship between science, economy, and society, and that the new forestry model sought to systematize local knowledge in order to transcend the local and then introduce empirical experimental methods to repeatedly and iteratively improve practice of resource management to satisfy the goals of new political economic doctrines. Importantly, this relied on a new kind of bureaucratic scientific approach to resource management. So how do we get from India to Romania then? I have found that Romanian foresters were not only aware of these kind of developments in British India, but were, fully engaged in conversations with agents working in what they called the English Indies. They were active members of these trans-imperial and transnational networks, which, despite a relative lack of attention today, drove the establishment of forestry in much of Eastern Europe, indeed globally. From the And I mean, just a kind of quick example of that, Brandis, who was, of course, the administrator of Indian forests, received a signed kind of autograph and letter from U.S. President Teddy Roosevelt for his contributions to the establishment of the American Forest Service as well. So these are truly global networks at play here. And from the Romanian perspective, it was already from the mid-19th century that elite Romanian foresters were trained almost exclusively at two foreign institutions, both of which bounded with different, but not too different, understandings of empire. The first and less kind of important, at least in terms of where their agents were ending up, was the Austrian and later Austro-Hungarian School of Mining and Forestry at Chemnitz. But the second, and which was the principal destination for Romanian foresters, was the French National School for Water Resources and Forestry in Nancy. And it was here in Nancy that most doctrinaires of Romanian forestry were produced. These, what I call Nancyites, were held an almost exclusive monopoly over the leadership of the Progressive Civic Society and thus the forestry institutions which it would give rise to. Now, why is Nancy important, right? Nancy, I don't know if, geographically, France does not lie between Romania and India, but in terms of these kind of intellectual networks, it certainly does. Because Romanian forestry candidates were trained in the French forestry system alongside others who were also sent to Nancy from around the world, developing close relationships between that institution and Romanian forestry engineers that the latter would leverage to construct new institutions back at home. A kind of example of this, it comes from forestry sciences professor working in Romania, Paul Curunau, who in 1906 dubbed Nancy this Mecca of forestry, to which all foresters around the globe, at least the ones worth talking about, must make pilgrimage. This relationship was vital to the emergence of Romanian forestry as a profession linked to global scientific activism networks. There they encountered and interacted with foresters from all over the world, including the British Imperial Forest Department, whose architect Brandis, who I've already mentioned, insisted that all imperial foresters be sent to be trained at Nancy. Importantly, the Romanian students mixed with and retained their connections with their imperial peers. These graduates returned to Romania with more than a French degree in hand. They returned with a mission to establish modern state institutions and connections to foresters, not only in European, but imperial service and knowledge of how these services were created elsewhere outside of Europe. Of course, following their graduation and dispersion from Nancy, foresters continued to communicate through personal networks and intermediary, of course, of forestry journals, as well as published works. They continued working and conversing with their Romanian colleagues and vice versa, and, for instance, informing them of forest conditions, new legislation going on in British India, and how these tied together with the civilizing mission there. Exchange of knowledge and experience was a central part of the forestry science across borders, and mostly took the form of private correspondence and, publishing in forestry journals. And a great example of this and how central it was to the mission here is that already in the first volume of Revista Pădurilor, in 1886, we see a contribution titled Pădurile din Indiile Engleze, The Forest of the English Indies, which was published from an excerpt of a letter sent to C.I. Ionescu, who was at the time serving as a forester in Ilfov County, from, of course, a Mr. Bell, forestry agent from the English Indies and colleague of the old Romanian students at the forestry school in Nancy, who then sends his comrades from Romania the following correspondence, which of course contains all sorts of information about what's going on in the British Raj. Romanian agents were therefore well acquainted with these colonial contexts, also through the works of other individuals who were then published in Revista Pădurilor. An example here from Austrian forester Ludwig Dimitz, who considered the forest organization of the British Indies as completely perfected. This success he resulted, which included some backhanded commentary as well, came from imperial foresters' victories over indigenous traditions of South Asian groups, where he wrote that for 100 years, the Hindus cultivate rice and millet on earth deforested through fire, slash and burn, agriculture. The alpha and omega for the conservation of forests here is formed by the fight to at least limit and regulate these practices. In the state forests, the English have in a short period proceeded systematically enough. This people, that being the English, which in their own country destroyed even the last remnants of a forest, has accomplished through their struggle the protection of the forests of East India. That Romanian foresters were part of such networks shouldn't be surprising, but it is. And it was to me when I first discovered them as well. Because these scientific networks were all about cooperation and exchange. The foresters who came from non-sea from all the world spread aspects of continental tradition of forestry globally, but also brought news and information from their respective institutions and regions, striving to maintain contact with their former classmates after receiving their field assignments. In states that lacked kind of well-established forestry institutions like France and some of the German states, in spaces like, for instance, Romania, they returned to what they considered a semi-feudal forest arrangement with weak or even non-existent state institutions, both of which they considered unfit for a modern European country. And they fought to establish forestry institutions from scratch, turning to familiar arguments and a civilizing potential of European temperate forests and forest management, comparing these to the kind of diseased, as they called them, tropical landscapes that they saw threatening Romanians' health and racial hygiene. The tropicalization of the Romanian interior and of peasant surroundings proved to be a powerful tool for justifying the need for modern state forestry in the emerging Romanian nation state. In their essays and congresses, forestry activists created the symptoms, but also offered a panacea for a disease eating away at the Romanian people, their ignorance. Should sound familiar for students of imperial history. These medical experts, they saw Romania as, to quote one scholar, a filthy world and suffering a social inferno, end quote. They looked to history and racial science to point out the dramatic effects of peasants' ignorant destruction of the nation's forests, and pointed specifically to South European climates as products and kind of what was to come should Romania follow the kind of practices of wasteful environmental management that these places experienced from ancient times. And of course, this was not a uniquely Romanian point of view. This was this kind of, this attack against Southern Europe was quite common among, foresters at the time, especially coming from Northern Europe, naturally. The forests, they claim, gave Europe its temperate climate and, by extension, its racial superiority over so-called tropical peoples, whose minds and bodies, they argued, became damaged by the effects of the heat or miasmatic, and bad air, otherwise treated by temperate, well-organized forests. The association between forests and public health was at the center of this discourse. In an article arguing for the creation of a centralized Romanian forestry corps, one forester stressed the beneficial effects of these temperate forests, noting that they, quote, moderate the extreme temperatures that are so damaging to man's health, as well as that of vegetation. They purify the area and contribute to a large degree to the well-being of marginal populations, especially in the mountains. Foresters' arguments were based first and foremost on prevention, but I'll get to in just a moment, not exclusively on prevention. Capable and modern management would prevent climate change and its damaging effects. However, foresters, of course, weren't alone in making claims to expertise on public health, right? And medical experts had already beaten them to adoption by powerful institutions like the military. Moreover, while foresters had a strong personal network, because of the absence of state forestry in much of the world, they lacked the foreign institutional support of medical experts. Part of the reason for the latter group's success in enlisting state agencies to carry out its mission. Medical institutions were already on the ground in rural spaces, working with institutions like the army, and concentrating on the fight against very real outbreaks of disease that were visible, measurable, and at least somewhat manageable through quarantine. An alliance which is prominently featured in the cartoon adorning Constantin Ardeleanu's new edited volume on epidemics and public health. And one point that I want to mention now is we see like the doctors working together with army personnel, using all kinds of modern tools to protect Romania, fighting against here plague and cholera that is sweeping Russia. And this is something we'll come back to in a second. So Romanian foresters sought to emulate medical experts and claimed that their management could be instrumental in this fight against diseases like cholera and yellow fever. explaining that climatic conditions, namely the expansion of the Eurasian steppe, right, were responsible for the advance of so-called Asiatic diseases. Some, like George Stătescu, who was the first chief editor of Revista Pădurilor, worked to blend forestry's climatic arguments with those of racial science, further tying human nature to the environmental factors. In one article, he drew on global forestry canon, notably Fernov and Andrei, to claim that entire countries could become sick due to the state of their forests. And of course, this linked 19th century European justifications for empire with a discourse of disease and sickness that was immediately relevant to the Black Sea region at the time. Warning of the negligent state approach towards the nation's forest, he offered a somber prognosis, comparing the imminent disaster of steppe expansion to progress in forestry management taking place in colonial and imperial spaces, noting that when vast stretches of forest are deforested, especially in tropical regions, diseases do not hesitate to declare themselves. And in here, diseases specifically refers to malaria and yellow fever. While on the other hand, reforestation has lessened the unhygienic conditions in unhealthy countries. Following Andrei and Fernov, the forests are an obstacle to the movement of diseases. A year later, he wrote how forestry serves not only as a preventative measure, but can also be a curative one as well, noting that the hygienic, and again, drawing on other so-called authoritative sources, in this case, French forestry professors, noting that the hygienic influence of plantations, forest plantations, and their action over certain diseases is known. Especially pine plantations have a beneficial influence against malaria and yellow fever, as well as tuberculosis. And here he cites a French professor saying that the workers laboring in pine forests are immune to tuberculosis, and citing another one saying that the suffering from tuberculosis has a 50% chance of recovery if one comes to open air therapy in such plantations. But it wasn't just disease that bothered the foresters. Racial degeneration was an even more troubling possibility. And according to them, the peasantry was at great risk of lapsing out of Europeanness entirely, a result of their ignorant destruction of wooded areas. Since forests were associated with temperate climates, their destruction, by corollary, would bring heat and desertification. They argue that the aspects of heat on the European body, again coming back to that idea of tropicalization, and mind would then cause the peasant to fall even deeper into so-called filth and melancholy. Foresters claimed that clean, well-ordered forests were necessary for cleaning the air, water, and soil, and mobilized the miasmatic discourse, previously key to labeling tropical areas as unhealthy and justifying European intervention, especially in places like Africa and British India and Southeast Asia. While the heat and climate were powerful enough to change the human body over the long term, the more immediate effects of kind of general environmental hygiene offered by forests reflected a further merging of ecological and medical arguments. Pointing to the role of parks and green spaces in urban environments purifying the air, a Viennese conference whose minutes were published in Revista Pădurilor noted that by extension, the air in the countryside was simply cleaner. And of course, their argument wasn't based off of the lack of people throwing excrement into the streets or the pollution caused by industry, but because rural places are just closer to trees, right? And these serve to regulate temperatures in both air and soil. This was the argument. Romanian foresters were well aware of such arguments made elsewhere and fully mobilized them at home. In a return to miasmatic theory, the article points to the forest's alleged propensity to store ozone, which they argued the oxidation properties of which serve to, quote, render harmless the bad smelling and harmful gases, and that the miasmas and the bad air, soil, and waterborne bacteria were ameliorated just by the presence of forests alone. Indeed, the author argued, citing other so-called authoritative voices, that this ozone produced a number of effects for the human body as well. He argued that it helps people to sleep better and that it has, quote, a very favorable positive influence over chronic nervous diseases. Importantly, forests also kept disease at bay, as Stătescu had previously argued, by keeping at bay the so-called northern winds, which, quote, very easily lead to disease, right? Again, we see that kind of argument against desertification, which they view as the expansion of the steppe from Russia into Europe. The article blamed the unbridled extension of agriculture for contributing to the rise of diseases in the region through what they called fertilization with urine, rubbish, etc. The rush for agricultural profit, according to this logic, came at the expense of beauty and, more importantly, hygiene and cleanliness of the environment, contributing to a public health and hygienic crisis for Romanian peasants. The climatic effects of forests and their ability to regulate temperature, they argued, was key to resolving this brewing disaster. Tying diseases to tropical hot regions, they claimed that the bacteria responsible thrive best at temperatures around 30 to 40 degrees Celsius, while the forests kept surrounding climates much more temperate, and they argued, even kill the bacteria at an ambient temperature of 16 degrees. So their early rhetoric really reflected many of these same tropes about disease, miasma, climate, and society that were perpetuated by colonial projects overseas. And so it's little wonder that the proposed solution came in the form of an internal colonial project, essentially using forestry as its spearhead. To rectify the ambiguity of this, Romania that they considered quasi-European at best, and therefore preventing its literal tropicalization and degeneration, became a rallying cry of foresters and their allies seeking the creation of institutions for the profession. As noted, temperate forests and their climates had long been associated with European intelligence and racial superiority, and this was, of course, at odds with the wholesale destruction of forests that scientists and others noticed during the late 19th and 20th century as agriculture expanded. As forests and landlords responded to market demands for increasing quantities of grain, especially from Romanian market, cutting down forests, and in the process, foresters increasingly connected the hygiene forests produced with racial well-being and Europeanness. This, of course, stemming from their physiocratic tradition of forestry, which argued for intensive rather than extensive growth of agriculture. The importance of forests was, especially important for maintaining European minds and bodies, as one Revista Pădurilor contributor put it already from the early years. Only well cared for forests exercise their complete natural influence for the needs of the people. The others do not either thank their proprietors, nor do they exercise a favorable influence over time over the land and climate. The very presence of the forest and their beauty, foresters claimed, had physical civilizing effects on the human body. In well-forested areas, everything becomes civilized. As we can see here in these parts, the population is richer and denser. There are beautiful villages and good roads, while the inhabitants, alongside the wood industry, occupy themselves with special commercial affairs. Behold how forests contribute to civilization and a good life. In contrast, other nations failed to protect their forests, leading to desertifications in which, quote unquote, humanity cannot live. And I'm going to replace a slur for another term here, Palestine, land of the Jews, and numerous countries in Asia and Africa, and even some Russian provinces. Thus, these countries are inhabited by more or less barbarous peoples, nations which do not progress but wallow. Again, we see the term wallow. Europeans weren't exempt, according to this logic, right? It was the climate that created them, and the destruction of that climate would lead to the barbarization of Romanians too. The same contributor that described these barbarous places noted that, as Europeans, we Romanians cannot follow this path. We have a duty to follow enlightened nations. Forester activists couldn't have been clearer in their rhetoric, in fact, with some already attributing tropical and barbaric qualities to rural Romania, especially in areas in which their profession lacked influence or presence and where so-called ignorant villagers ruled. One forester in northern Romania, comparing the neighboring Romanian and Austrian villages, bemoaned the state of regression of Romanians living near the so-called steppe deserts, likening them to those that the civilizing mission deemed in dire need of the white man's intervention. Were Stanley to visit these localities, we think he would be hard-pressed to distinguish them from African tribes, and he would find these in the Belgium of the East. There are villages directly across the Prut in Austria, but one can discern a system in their construction, enclosure with stone or admirable fences, gardens with fruit trees, and the surroundings of the village alive, beautiful houses and even auxiliary rooms. With our villager, none of these. The houses resemble gray boulders thrown about the field without any symmetry, which makes you unintentionally exclaim, a wild country. With never before seen stubbornness, our villagers do not want to rise from the dirt in which they wallow. And I use this painting by Henry Trenck of a group of Roma, specifically because of the allusion in this quote to boulders thrown about a field, right? It's kind of representative there. This behavior was not always attributed merely to ignorance. Alternatively, it was the nature of Romanians to destroy their environments through ill will, another derivative of justifications for empire. Nicolae Popovici, who became later the director of the Romanian Advanced School for Forestry, argued that it was the nature of the Romanian to deforest for short-term gain or simply out of spite of regulations, which he acknowledged was a widespread belief among his colleagues. For him, it was a national neurosis, saying that, and when each of us, not just some, have had the occasion to see for ourselves how the Romanian peasant often destroys without any kind of profit, and only out of ill will, the trees planted alongside the road, along the sides of roads, cordons, which would serve him a lot in the first place, whether for marking the direction of the road in wintertime or as shade in the summertime in the midst of tropical heat, again with the tropicality, we see and observe all these ill intentions of the nature of the Romanian. Popovici argued that, of course, coercive power was necessary. So while these depictions were at least partially born of frustration, their reliance on colonial tropes represented a very targeted and intentional approach. Indeed, Popovici himself was a proud non-Seite seeking to institute what he had learned from his experience there and from his colleagues in other parts of the world. The idea was better described of a heavily regimented system and equipped by an interwar speaker at a Progressive Civic Society conference who said, everything must be predicted, identified, controlled. Arbitrariness and luck do not exist. New works demand new people. So I argue that the depiction of the rural countryside as a wild country was anything but accidental. It was a provocation. Forester activists wanted to embarrass the ruling elite to take action on centralized forest management. Alongside their complaints of peasant ignorance and warnings of racial and environmental degradation were these comparisons of stagnancy or even regression of Romania compared to the progresses which were seen in non-European countries like, or better said, colonies like India. The comparison of Romania as a country far behind India in harnessing the forests for medical, economic, and climatic reasons proved a powerful rhetorical device. Already in 1886, George Stătescu wrote that Romania should aspire to the successes and systems of India, pointing specifically to Brandis's Imperial Forest Department. A decade and a half later, another forester wrote in praise of imperial and state settler colonial societies' ability to control and administer their forests, pointing to the rapid implementation of practices in India. The idea that Romania, a supposedly European nation, should be behind non-European nation in carrying out a distinctly European experiment represented the standard opinion of the foresters at the time, who looked at the Indian activism campaign and its successes toward the institutionalization of forestry as a success story worth emulating. Of course, there was a great deal of shock value here. If non-Europeans could be civilized by proper forest management, then so could the Romanian peasants, right, who, according to this rhetoric, were falling behind Indians in their level of civilization. The creation of modern forestry institutions was therefore rendered a national duty, an obligation, not just for the good of the European Romanian, but for the socioeconomic and hygienic good of the nation and future generations. These institutions were a condition for Romania to be considered a proper, enlightened country in the European tradition. Such arguments caught the ears of important statesmen within the Romanian political sphere. Politically powerful aristocratic reformers and politicians seeking to improve Romanian society through rationalized modernization of rural life and production. And it's worth noting that conservative politicians, oftentimes large landowners, didn't really buy into this. Those who did were almost all key liberals in the government or in kind of higher functions. An exception to this being Barbubelu, but Key liberals included Ion Câmpineanu, who was at the time governor of the National Bank of Romania, Ion Calinderu, who, as I'll get into, was a key figure um, for the crown, Dimitrie Sturza and Anastase Stolojan, who all held important ministerial and government positions at the time. These all became important and active participants, or at least patrons of the society, and aided forester activists gain much needed political capital, especially, if not funds. Political support came especially from two figures in particular, Ion Calinderu, who was the administrator of the crown's domains for nearly 3 decades and a close confidant of King Charles I, and Alexandru Constantinescu, who was a member of parliament and repeatedly served as Minister of Agriculture. Calinderu was a decided paternalist in a very progressive way, kind of, very much fitting into the liberal mold at the time, believed that rural Romanians needed guiding direction, which was, of course, not all that far from 19th century imperialist logic. He was an avid supporter of the society and played an important role in its foundation and served as a foot in the door, a foot in the door of the political scene, becoming its honorary president for decades. Importantly and very symbolically, he placed the society's headquarters on the premises of the administration of Crown Estates. Calinderu also made numerous forest grants from the royal estates to establish model forests, which became key to showcasing to dignitaries that forestry was ideal for turning a kind of quasi-European or ambiguous countryside, Romanian countryside, into a decidedly European, carefully managed space. Constantinescu, on the other hand, gave foresters something that Calinderu, who wasn't an elected member of the parliament or a member of the government, could not, empowered and coercive state institutions. His association with the Progressive Civic Society ensured a direct seat at the negotiating table when it came time to formulate a new forest code, which was promulgated in 1910. As part of the process, he crafted legislation also establishing that much desired permanent forestry corps, Casa Pădurilor Statului, or the administration of state forests, which was known shorthand within the society, at least, as the forest police. And this institution would later evolve into what is now called Romsilva, after a few different changes across the century. After the First World War, he also worked towards a massive extension of these institutions into the countryside, so much so that following his death in 1926, members of society enshrined him in the pantheon of Romanian forestry as, quote, directly responsible for the entire organization of our corps, all of the progresses we enjoy today. The Code of 1910 expanded on many aspects of the wanting Code of 1881, notably creating powerful environmental law enforcement provisions, while also representing an attempt at a very radical redrawing of rural life, what it meant to be a citizen of a modern country, and political economy of rural areas. The code, along with the twin law establishing the Forestry Corps, were really, I argue, the coronation of state forestry in Romania. So much so that many of these individuals, like Popovici, for instance, became extremely powerful members of government and elected officials in the 1920s and 30s. The code took aim at indigenous village commons named obști and sought to formalize rural and traditional household economies and communities with the goal to make them legible for the modern state, because the modern state is all, of course, about surveillance and being able to control. And subjugate these to the administration of state forests. It attempted nothing less than a radical rationalization and modernization, and therefore I argue Europeanization of Romanian forestry environments and the socioeconomic contexts in which they existed. And I want to leave off just with a very kind of quick picture that I took that kind of really shows the continuation of this civilizational discourse in environmental management, right? This sign on a trash can in a park in Bucharest, right, which states that people died in the revolution, that is the revolution of 1989, for a free and civilized Romania. Of course, the implication being pick up your trash. This is a natural space, right? So I'll leave it there. I look forward to questions and our conversation.
Thank you, George, for this very rich presentation and dealing with all these issues and relating also the forestry to health issues and so many other discussions that developed during the 19th century. And congratulations for the presentation. So if you have any questions, just raise your hand, or maybe you can drop your comments in the chat, and I'll try to pick them up. I don't promise I will take them in the right order, but I will try to keep an eye on wherever you, or you can just unmute yourself and shoot a question. If you don't have any, I can break the ice. So I thank you for this presentation. I was just wondering if you looked also at how forestry departments and Progresul Silvic saw Dobruja, because the appearance of Progresul Silvic coincides with the annexation of Dobruja to the United Kingdom, so the Romanian Kingdom. So I'm just curious on these issues, and also if you look at how commercial companies for wood extraction entered the market in Romania. For example, you know very well that you have Austrian, Hungarian, Italian companies that started to work in Transylvania, Bukovina, and suddenly they were related to the Goats company from Galatz, and which was the main exporter of wood in Palestine, in Egypt, and so on. So this is just to break the ice. So thank you.
I can answer, or we can take a few questions if there are any more.
You can answer, and
Okay.
maybe people will think of others.
So it's an interesting point, Dobroja, because while I'm speaking about the this kind of racialization of the Romanian peasant as something inferior or something in need of a civilizing intervention, Dobroja changes that to an extent, because these peasants, which in the presentation I showed were looked down on quite heavily as a kind of ignorant, potentially non-European element. It's all relative, right? Because the need to displace Turkish and other Oriental, so-called Oriental elements that were present in Dobroja led to some foresters, to argue for a separate kind of colonial project, one which has received a bit more attention, that is the colonies created in Dobroja, but also in parts of Moldova around this time period, to resettle especially peasants from what were considered more overpopulated rural spaces. The key here, though, is that the foresters weren't looking at the kind of social or racial component of Dobroja. They were more concerned with first fixing the environment of Dobruja, which was, of course, decidedly un-European, especially in places like the Delta and in the plains. The need to import European species and create plantations there were seen as first steps to establishing these colonies, right, of Romanians that would be basically moved there to Romanianize this territory and change the demographics, which was ultimately the kind of goal there. But of course, without first changing the environment, well, does it matter if we're moving Romanians there because they're going to degenerate? They're going to feel the effects of this non-European space. So the goal there really was, we need to find, European species. And ironically enough, the species that they turned to were in many ways from North America, not Europe itself. Black locust, salcamu, like especially was heavily pushed by forestry, by practitioners of forestry as like one of the key species that could serve to Europeanize this space and prevent not only desertification in some areas, but also improve drainage of other spaces in others. In terms of commercial companies, this is going back a bit to what I was speaking before. The foresters thought that they alone should kind of dictate the management of these spaces. And in fact, one forester from this time period, speaking later in the interwar period, said that there were two frauds of the 19th century. One is democracy, and the other is the corporation. So these were the two great frauds that were invented in the 19th century, according to Forester Eliescu, who was present, by the way, in both of those portraits of the society from 1888 and from 1910. They did not get along with these commercial companies. They had to be bedfellows, right? To a certain extent, they had to work together. But really, what they sought was the nationalization of all forest resources. And this is something that they got very close to in 1930 with the reformulation of the administration of state forests, which created essentially the administration of state forests not only as an institution but as a state enterprise, which kind of had its own, networks and horizontal as well as vertical integration as a corporation might, dealing heavily with export again to Palestine, to Egypt, even to Sudan, which they sought to integrate vertically so as to kind of exclude as much as possible other corporations. And it's this kind of alternative mode of organizing that later became Romsilva as a kind of state enterprise. So they were much more concerned, especially in this early period, not so much with dealing with these companies, so much as preventing the kind of wholesale destruction that they saw going on, which was primarily based on the expansion of agriculture, and the sale of those forests to these companies or the leasing of these places to these companies was more a byproduct of that agricultural expansion than kind of wholesale exploitation.
Thank you for your answer. We have another question from Cosmin Minia. Cosmin, please.
First of all, if you can hear me, okay. Yes, okay, because I wasn't sure with my headphones. So your presentation was very interesting, and thank you, Cosmin, for inviting me to it. I'm a colleague, yes, with him at the New York College in Bucharest. We are working on environmental history, but my field of expertise is really historical monuments, architectural heritage. So I'm far from the theme of forestry. At the same time, I was very kind of, I am interested in, seeing 19th century Romania also as a kind of a quasi-colonial power in a way at a lower scale. And you were speaking about this internal colonization project, which of course happened at many levels. So in a way, I'm not sure if forestry is, as you said, spearheaded the project in a way. I can think of many, like medicine, or even my project of restoring historical monuments was something that you could see was affected, or where you could see the civilizational discourse. And I think my question is a bit maybe pushes you a bit maybe forward to an unfinished part in a way of your project. So what were the actual effects of the forestry development, of the forest code of 1910? So how did it affect the local population in terms of, economy? Because this is when we speak about colonization, this is essentially it. It's how it affected the local population. So, and you didn't really speak about this. And on the contrary, in a way, you showed us this very nice environmental discourse about how forests are good, things that we can agree today. So a lot of the excerpts from those people are something that with which we agree to, like trees are good and so on. They allow us to breathe fresh air. So what was in a way wrong at the ground level, basically? This is my question. If I was clear.
Yeah, I think let me take the first one part of your comment to say that my argument is not so much that forestry spearheaded this kind of colonization project, but that's how they saw themselves, right? And that's how they sold themselves to these institutions. Um, right. Specifically because they saw how well it worked for instance, medical experts, right? In kind of selling themselves as agents of the state. In terms of, what this 1910 code does, I think I can speak very broadly to it in that it essentially dictates how Romania handles forests even to today. Um, the 1910 code lasts throughout the interwar period. It survives the kind of coming of the socialist government. The socialists use it as a kind of legal justification for the nationalization of forests and collectivization, and they find that it works so well that they don't replace it until the 1960s. Um, so it's something that has a very long-lasting legacy. In terms of how it actually affected people on the ground, um, at the point of it being promulgated, realistically, very little. Because again, these institutions had just been born alongside the law. There weren't trained foresters to work through these things. There weren't even surveys of, many parts of the country that were conducted. So the first step was we need to send people out into the countryside and just collect data. Where it did affect people was through especially the legal frameworks that permitted various, communal forms of management to operate. And there has been other work. I didn't really delve into this because there's been great work done um, by I think Juana Mateescu on this topic. So I didn't feel that there was a need for me to kind of reinvent the wheel there. But what I found in all of this research was, okay, there are people evaluating how this change affected people on the ground, but nobody's talking about where these ideas came from. How are these ideas being implemented? What is it actually changing the 1910 code? Um, and why? So that's kind of the question that I'm interested here in this particular instance. I can say that one way in which this was highly influential for rural spaces is in the way that foresters wanted rural people to interact with the forests. Because of course, this isn't some kind of, environmental protection for the sake of environmental protection. They wanted to preserve environments, right? This is the kind of sustainable yield principle that is at the center of forestry. But it's, aside from this kind of civilizational discourse, there's an economic motive behind it. They simply see other people using the forest in a way that they consider rapacious and destructive, and they say, we can manage this better while making a profit, right? So at the end of the day, it is a kind of civilizational discourse, but forestry at the time was entirely concerned with the economics and not so much with, trees are nice, we should protect them. That was kind of more so a rhetorical device that was used at the time. And even if they believed it, ultimately the goal of their profession was, sustainable yield. We will manage parcels in such a way that we can chop this one down and have it regrow in 40 years so we can chop it down again, right? Um, so the way that they wanted people to interact with it was, through their system. They wanted rural people to work for them as woodcutters, as transporters, to take part in a forest economy, but on their terms, more or less, kind of to the exclusion of, commons or other informal uses of the forest. Even things like, gathering nuts in the forest was problematic for the foresters because this hindered reforestation efforts. You can't send your pigs anymore into the forest to forage because, well, we need those acorns, actually.
Thank you. Actually, it was interesting to hear you now and also in your presentation how, in a way, how beautiful this discourse was packed, when presented. It's something we can, as you said, see even today. Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Georgia, for answering. We have a question in the chat from Camille Pârvu. I will read the question. Thank you so much for this presentation. Could you say more about their discourses concerning the property structure of forests? A scientific/colonial stewardship of forests meant also remaking the ownership forms. Thank you again. Thank you, Camille, for the question.
Thank you, Camille. Yes, it's a very interesting question because again, in that letter, excerpts of which were published to Revista Pădurilor, from the so-called Mr. Bell from India, the letter essentially details the new Indian Forest Code, which radically redrew the way that land ownership and use was permitted throughout the empire. And of course, property structures, especially regarding forests, in many parts of Romania were largely informal. And even if they were structured according to kind of, semi-feudal, pre-land reform of 1921 means of, large landowner might allow the peasants to go in there to get what they need, maybe, right? Or village commons among the kind of free villages. This was a problem for foresters from both perspectives. On the one hand, there was no incentive for landowners to allow people to have oversight over their property. Large landowners certainly hired foresters, but they did not want a kind of state administrative organ having a say over their lands, right? On the other hand, the informal nature of commons makes them more or less impossible to surveil and manage and tax and take surveys of. Because of course the modern property management regime is dependent on more or less private ownership, right? Which can be finagled in a few different ways to allow for some forms of collective ownership, for instance, having a share of a common forest. But really, even these kinds of ways of looking at forests through a share, right, is something that emerged predominantly after the 1910 code in order to align these more informal practices to the new legal provisions of the Forest Code of 1910. The other aspect of the Forest Code, which was also present in 1881 code, but impossible, frankly, to implement, was the need to have a management plan for any form of manipulation of a forest, its composition, using it economically, even if it doesn't involve cutting down the forest, right? Taking stones, cutting turf, sending sheep or goats or pigs to pasture or cows to pasture in the forest. These are all things that impacted the regeneration capacity of trees, which is ultimately what forestry is interested in, trees as kind of commodity for wood. And so this kind of these new ideas of stewardship and how to deal with these informal means of ownership were very much present in the reformulation of the Indian Forest Code, which allowed for some village forests to continue to exist, but it nationalized, in effect, many of the forests, placing them directly under imperial administration, and other ones were continued to be permitted to be used by large plantation owners. The structure is remarkably similar in the Forest Code of 1910, predominantly because these were simply the forestry ideas of the time. They weren't unique to Romania, is kind of the argument that I'm making in many ways here. They were simply, not to say that they were borrowing them, they recognized the need to change things according to the circumstances and contexts of Romania itself. But this was kind of a larger global conversation about how do we make property legible, essentially. I hope that answers the question.
Thank you for answering. We have another question from Gabriel Girigan. Gabi, please.
Okay, I hope you can hear me. Okay, so thank you, Cosmin, for inviting me to this interesting conversation with Georgia, and thank you, Georgia, for this presentation. I have like let's say three comments. Partially, you've answered some of my, let's say, my question that I noted here in my notebook. I'm pretty much new in this field, but I was just, let's say, um, wondering about and trying to make some connections of what you've already presented. So maybe can you make some, maybe in a way from what you've from your research, how this connects with, let's say, with justice in terms of, let's say, for the peasants, for example, for this backwardness, this depiction of backwardness and unfilthiness. And as far as I know, it was really important for the local authorities, for example, this, and how this connects with the power of I think Camille is also was also asking this. So this, let's say, this weapon of local authorities to re um, to reimagine the landscape, you know, in with formal instruments. And uh, how do peasants deal with that in a way of, are there any weapons of the poor in this, let's say, in this saga, or not? And the second observation is more like a funny one. I've done some field work, and some of our respondents told us about the Douglas pinewood, and how this pine was trying to be, let's say, in put it in the soil of the nearby forest, but it was not so stable, this pinewood, which was intended for commercial use. And it was really funny because they told us that the local soil and the local wood was more powerful than the Douglas pine. And it was such a nice rhetoric, it was like a continuity of a kind of I don't know what I'm trying to say. It's like a kind of a Cold War in terms of species. And while I was hearing you, it just came in my mind, this discourse. And I think it could be really interesting to make like continuities and discontinuities of the discourse. And I think it was really relevant also after 1989, because the Lupu law, especially, and then it was also this kind of rhetoric of, let's go back to what was in the interwar period, yeah, mostly, and for the restitution processes. And also the local authorities were really had the power of being a game changer in this, and how this interplay. So thank you, and sorry, I didn't want to speak too much.
No, that's fantastic. I'm really drawn to this example of the local soil being, more powerful than the Douglas fir, because as a counter example to that, we have like the black locust tree, which has, received more or less the endemic status, like sarcoma. Like, it's gained this kind of cultural acceptance as, this tree that, but in reality, was brought up as a kind of Europeanizing tree, right, to change the landscape. But to your first question about justice, this is a really important question, and one that I delve into in a different chapter of the dissertation, because there are indeed local responses to this. And this is something that before the First World War, the push existed at the higher level, but again, they lacked the institutional means to do so. These were very new things. Um, there was still a lot of political debate. The debates to pass the Code of 1910 were extremely heated. Um, and conservatives, vehemently opposed it for a number of reasons. Um, but following the First World War and the kind of socio-political changes that came with that, especially the land reforms of 1919 to 1921, and the creation of, an ostensibly democratic society in a certain way, right, gave these people that were suddenly viewed no longer as ignorant, or but maybe to some people they still were, but they were now, citizens, right? They were active participants in the political sphere. And this really kind of impacted how local authorities interacted with these laws. In most cases that I found looking at in local archives, which actually formed the basis of my research, in the vast majority of cases, local authorities were fighting against the Forest Service, like not with it or in its interests. Um, and that could be for multiple interests, for multiple reasons. Of course, the local administrations suddenly were elected, right? And so you have to, have this kind of relationship with your constituency that will get you reelected, right? As kind of flawed as the democratic regime was in that time period. But in terms of the weapons of the poor, in my other chapter, I look specifically at questions of, what does environmental justice look like in this context, and, in this kind of post land reform moment, where many people were very unhappy with the land reform because it didn't do what it promised, right? Or it did so very poorly. But people now had this kind of relationship with the state that was very different, right? No longer just a subject, but a citizen with an active stake politically. And they very actively used this, and shamelessly so. So they were not only petitioning local administrators, they were sending petitions directly to the king, right? To say, here's what's going on, here's why it's an injustice. Um, and they were framing themselves as the modern ones, right? As opposed to these kind of coercive practices, which went against political modernity, right? That now existed in Romania in that time period. Of course, there were, more thinking about like the way that Scott originally used the term, weapons of the poor. There were certainly instances of foresters, you know, catching all sorts of, crimes that they argued were, illegal. And indeed, according to the 1910 code, one of the things that the 1910 code did was many of the practices that peasants did before were suddenly illegal, right? You could no longer pasture. You could no longer do anything without permission and without this very intricate, detailed plan that before the 1920s had to have a royal decree signed off on it to be able to permit use of a forest, right? This absurd, like bureaucratic system. People still did it anyway. One peasant committee, I recall, this is like burned into my mind, um, wrote to, or rather presented themselves to the Forestry Committee that was, hearing them about their petition to gain more forest land in line with population growth because they needed more wood, right? They had more animals to pasture, etc. And their petition was denied. And they went to before the commission and they said, like, but we don't need, you know, we don't need you to give us the wood. We just need your permission. We can go get it ourselves if we need to, right? So it's this kind of whole aspect of justice that comes out. But I found it particularly gains, it gains a lot of purchase after the kind of democratization of the larger part of Romanian society after World War One. But it's a great question, and one to which there are many humorous examples and ways in which people subverted these laws, in fact.
Thank you, Georgia, for your answer. Any other questions, if you have? Since we moved also the discussion a bit after the First World War. I know Georgia also dealt with the interwar period in his dissertation, so I can shoot another question until you prepare others. I was just curious how during the interwar period, the appearance of CAPS took over the forestry codes that were active in Transylvania, Bessarabia, and Bukovina, because they were pretty quite different from one from another. Of course, Bukovina had was under administration of Austria, and Transylvania had the forestry code from 1879, and Bessarabia another one. So I was just curious, how did you tackle this in your work? Thank you.
I chose to sidestep that issue by focusing just on Transylvania. Because otherwise it's too complicated. It's so much. I was speaking to, I had this conversation in 2021 with Stefan Dorondel, and he was like, this, this is a bad idea. And I was like, yeah, you're right. So I focused mostly on Transylvania, and mostly I chose to approach this kind of question not through the kind of elite lens that I looked at for the pre-World War I period, but look specifically at rural archives and, how did the actual agents who were in these places work? How did they view their work? How did people react to it? How did local administrations interact with their work? Especially because this was such a hectic time period, right? Um, there was a transition period in which very messily the laws were slowly being phased out. The kind of Hungarian laws were slowly being phased out, and the Romanian ones were being expanded into these new territories. Um, and as you might imagine, it led to quite a bit of dissatisfaction, not just among, ethnic minorities that were being dispossessed of their forests, and not just elites, right? We're talking about village commons and cooperatives that are just, being ravaged by these expropriations. But also Romanians, right? They weren't happy with this. One petition that was sent to the Minister of Agriculture at the time, stated, please, the first thing they said was, please forward this to the king, right? But at the end of the petition, they closed it by saying, basically, this is in a democratic Romania, this is unacceptable. We lived better under the Hungarians than under these new laws. And so the kind of, argument against, or the kind of, the assumption that, right, ethnic Romanians should be siding with the Romanian government is very much unfounded. And, scholars have, looked at the kind of, you know, maybe unexpected from the kind of traditional historiographical approach to these questions, community between ethnic minorities and Romanians in this time period. And like Gabor has written on this as well. But yeah, in terms of how, now you mentioned CAPS was founded in 1930, right, as a kind of revitalization of Casa Pădurilor Statului. The kind of addition of the autonomous aspect, right, to this administration essentially creates it into a form of corporation, a state enterprise, which is no longer, subject to the Ministry of Agriculture as it was before, but now has this kind of, it's still centralized, but the resources are being kind of spaced out. They're no longer dependent on the directorates of the Ministry of Agriculture. They have their own institutions. And this complicates relationships at the local level, specifically because, well, what do the local administrations gain from dealing with this, state enterprise who is basically just an exploitation company at this point, right? Who wants to nationalize for their own economic good, not for any other reason. Well, they gain very little, and in fact, resistance against decisions and court battles, skyrocket during this time period, as people and especially local administrations start to fight back a little bit within this new kind of democratic political context. But there's also opportunity here, and this is something that I get into in one of my later dissertations, because it's not all resistance, right? If you play by the state's rules, there are opportunities. And it was especially people who were at the lower socioeconomic rungs in these rural spaces that, in many cases, out of desperation, if nothing else, really, really wanted to be hired by CEAPESE. The CEAPESE being the Casa Autonomă a Pădurilor Statului, the autonomous administration of state forests. Um, and these were seen as jobs that were forms of welfare, like social welfare. Not only did you have like pay that you would receive from the state, you'd be eligible for pension, if you worked there for long enough in certain areas, not all of them. A lot of it was done by piecework, especially at the lower level. But you were given land as part of your arrangement for working for the state. So CEAPESE and before that Casa Pădurilor would segment a certain part of the land that it controlled and basically lease it out to these employees. They gained land that they could use as garden plots. They were called terenuri de hrană, so like feedlands. But also they gained free firewood. They had access to all sorts of benefits that really drew, and the administrators were very conscious of this. They knew that the applicants they were getting were the lowest rungs um, of their local society. And of course, this also created all sorts of problems at the local level. And it's what happens when, somebody at the lowest socioeconomic position of a village suddenly is given basically unlimited coercive power over other members of the village. This was a very serious question.
Hmm. Yeah, you're absolutely right here because if I remember correctly, you have also the examples given by Istvan Ciuciu in his analysis of Transylvania when you have forest delicts or forest tensions between Banfi family and some Romanians, some modes. And suddenly they try to calm down the villagers by signing contracts with the upper class of the villagers. So also the village has its own social stratification and power dynamics. And the guys who signed the contract with the Banfi family were almost excluded from the community just because they entered. So this is quite important to show also. And also in terms of forest laborers, you know very well that on the Bistrița Valley, Plutaj, I think they had other log rafters. They had other statuses than those working for the CEAPESE or yes. Yes, so any other questions if you have? If not, we can still discuss other. I know George's work, so I can try to push him to other places of his dissertation. So in terms of popularization, you also wrote about the Serbarea Sădirii. Maybe we can discuss a bit if you want, if you are willing to discuss for our participants. How did it develop and what was the use of this?
Yeah, so this was basically it's Arbor Day for our American speaking or American speaking English speaking, but it is an American kind of originating holiday. And the foresters, when they weren't off, decrying the kind of so-called disastrous social conditions in the countryside and calling for coercive power, they knew that the coercive power was not a long-term solution, right? But they also knew that the coercive power would be necessary for the immediate generation that they were dealing with. Their end goal was, in fact, one of the kind of originating goals of the Progresso Civic Society were popularization efforts. And this is something that especially became pushed in the interwar period, but that was discussed even before and during the war. Already, Nikolai Popovich, for instance, was a major proponent of importing these celebrations, Arbor Day celebrations from the United States. And he also pointed to similar celebrations in the Russian Empire, which were small and relatively new, but still, he claimed that they had a large impact. The French also had a similar kind of celebration. And I don't speak French, so I won't even try to pronounce, the French version of it. But it was primarily the Americans that they were looking at in terms of Arbor Day celebrations. This was before the First World War. There were all kinds of arguments for it. Didn't happen. The Ministry of Public Instruction actually promulgated a decree in 1912 that argued that all schools should engage with this kind of celebration. No enforcement mechanisms. Of course, nobody did it, right? At least on the mass stage that they wanted. It was in the kind of in the midst of the First World War when one forester, Daniel Klein, who was the son of a German doctor, actually born in Romania, uh, becomes like a hyper nationalist, anti-Semite during the interwar period. He is the forestry chief at Sinaia, right? So he has all kinds of connections to the royal family. He goes to then Crown Prince Carol II and says, here's what we can do. You are the kind of head of the Romanian scouting organization as your kind of ceremonial role. And, here's what we're doing in Sinaia. We want to kind of spread it throughout the country. And Charles II says, yeah, let's do it. Orders a decree. All rural scouts must engage with tree planting celebrations. Not only must they engage with it, they must be propagandists of the culture of forestry throughout the country. They need to take these ideas back into their villages, back into their families, back into their homes. And this is something that explodes after the First World War because suddenly you have institutions that actually have some kind of power. You have foresters like Popovich, who was already advocating for these celebrations before the First World War. Uh, Members of the Progressive Civic Society are elected as deputies, senators. They become people with serious clout in the political scene, while also still leading the Progressive Civic Society. So the Progressive Civic Society really is the one pulling the strings when it comes to this. Because the leaders of, for instance, Casa Pădurilor and the Forest Administration and later the Autonomous Forest Administration, they are also the leaders of the Progressive Civic Society. There is some generational change, like Popovich dies in the 1920s, for instance, and new foresters who are actually largely now trained in Germany and other kind of Italy, for instance, spaces that are coming with different ideas, but ultimately they want the same thing, right? So they're still pushing for popularization efforts. And it was Marin Dracea, whose name now adorns the kind of Forestry Research Institute, um, and Vintila Stinghe, who I can't remember what year it was. I think it was 1928. They come to the podium at the Congress and they deliver this kind of dual speech saying we need to revitalize this society. We can't be this kind of society of elites anymore. We need to reach out to the people because they can't be all, this coercive thing just isn't working, right? Future generations need to buy into this idea because it's going to be less work for us later, basically. And so the society funds it, right? The state isn't giving much money to this thing. This is funded by collections within the society, which are then given to, the Forest Administration, the Autonomous Administration of Forests, and it's largely a private initiative. Foresters themselves are using the resources provided by the society to organize their own, right, celebrations and Arbor Day celebrations. And these grow to such a level that, for instance, Klein became the head of the forest region in Pitești, and he is getting the entire army garrison of the city to participate. All the dignitaries of the city are there. He's giving speeches. All the schools are assembled in the square, and he's giving a speech about forestry is the future of the nation because we need to protect our environment as Romanian citizens. So it really becomes a kind of hyper-nationalistic thing that becomes enshrined in law when all students and young people are forced to join the the youth organization um, created in the latter part of the 1930s. So it's something that emerges in this kind of, period where they're still considering, the effects of the importability of colonialism, for instance. And I would argue that it's a kind of a legacy of that to a certain extent. It's certainly a legacy of the global networks that are at play here.
Yes, thank you for your answer. I also just remember about you were mentioning Stinges, so I was just remembering they brought up the most scientific part of the CHAPESE, which was ECHEF. And I remember that at a certain point they started building their own museum that was in the Parcul Carol, in which they had small toys and dioramas with peasants working in the forests. And also, speaking, you mentioned the Roma, they also had rudari that were put in miniature in these dioramas brought up by Chef. Yes.
It's interesting that you mentioned that because one thing that, I thought I would find a lot of would be discussion of the Roma. Zero,
Mm,
zero in any of the documents that I've looked at the high level,
mm.
at the low level, they are completely non-existent in any of my sources, which I think speaks to the kind
Oh,
of, the lack of their
mm,
representation there. But it was curious because, Roma, certain groups of Roma basically lived off of forest economies. They were active, participants in these things, but they weren't mentioned at all.
mm. Well, you have in the Revista Padrurio has at least three mentions in which they say, okay, the Roma Rudari, which are settling in the forest, should be excluded because they're a flagell for the forest, just because they are. There is this term, enclave forestiera, which is debated by the Forestry Department during the interwar period, and which says that includes the Roma in this kind of technical jargon, and which they try to show that okay, they are just intruders in our forest because they are just settling there, and we can't exploit the forest
Mhm.
by on our own terms. So,
Yeah, of course, the problem being that the Romanians and other people were doing the same thing, right?
of course.
So, according to these people, so yeah, it's interesting.
Mhm. Yeah. So, any other questions from anybody? If not, we can call it a day and look forward for the upcoming vacation. And thank you again, Georgia, for your presentation. It was fascinating to hear so many stuff about the history of forestry in Romania, and this is quite important. And congratulations for your dissertation and all your work up until now. And good luck in what comes next. And wish you all a good vacation, and thank you for joining us. And keep an eye on the website from European Society for Environmental History. And if you have any other ideas, just shoot an email, or you can also contact, I think, George, if you have other question that comes up later in your mind, and for sure you can contact him, and he will be glad to answer you. So thank you again for coming, and wish you a nice vacation.
Yes, thank you, everyone. No, it was a good turnout.
Was good, yes. I was I was scared that nobody would come after I saw that. I heard that it was six, but in the end it was 46. That's good.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for the invitation, and this was great.
Yes, thank you, Georgia, for your work. It's so great because we totally lack like, institutional histories in Romania, you don't have too many. Speaking also about science, not too much. So it's very important because yeah, people would love to deconstruct and decolonize and that kind of stuff, but
Yeah.
and jump to multi-species studies and more than human studies, but you end up not knowing who pulled all the strings.
Yeah.
Like, so this is
Well,
important.
that's how I came to this. So,
Yes,
you
of
know,
course.
I needed to
We
do
had
it.
lots of discussions with other colleagues and trying to jump to more than human, but
Hmm.
just start with the basic, and then we will do this also multi-species
Yeah.
studies, more decolonizing and that kind of stuff, which is extremely important.
Well,
But it's
it's
important to
yeah.
know who we are dealing with. If you say Marin Drecea, who is Marin Drecea? If you say Popovic, and
Yeah. Well, many of these people just don't have any presence, right? Uh, like, Ionescu, for instance,
Mm,
this is a nobody, right? But he's getting correspondence
yeah,
from India. Why? So it's kind
exactly.
of yeah, yeah.
Ex-
Well,
So
thank
your
you.
work is very important. I hope you will take it to the publishing step. And thank you, Elena, for attending.
Thank you.
And I hope that you will end up publishing your dissertation. It's very important. And good
Yeah,
luck.
I
And
hope so too. It's now the kind of speaking to publishers and yeah,
that's
we'll
very,
see. Yeah.
that's very. And I don't know, maybe next year we will meet again somewhere. I don't
Well,
know
I
where,
was hoping
but
to be at SRSE, but my
you want.
no, because my we're expecting the child exactly at May 25.
Oh,
So I
oh,
don't think my wife would appreciate
but it's
me.
even better. It's an even better news. So you will
Yeah.
enjoy the moment.
Yeah.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
even in the autumn for the ESHs in Uppsala, did you apply for with
I
a
did
paper or
not
anything?
because I
Ah,
wouldn't have had any kind of travel support for that, unfortunately.
okay. Oh,
Not at
too
the
bad.
moment anyway. Yeah. It was the awkward time between the transition of PhD to being employed that was, kind of fell into that uh,
Okay.
uncertain time. Yes.
Okay, so now you're stable, good with
Stable
the
enough. I'm still
affiliation.
yeah, so
And,
I'm working at IU in a more or less administrative capacity, but I'm kind of applying to several academic posts. Yeah.
okay, thank you for everything, and
Yeah.
we'll hear soon from each.
Well, yeah, thank you, Cosmin, and thank you, Kati, for organizing.
Thank you.
Okay,
See you
bye-bye.
soon. Bye bye.